will become a refuge for those who escape. It will come back to reclaim their inheritance. At that time, Israel will be a raging fire, and Edom a field of dry stubble. The fire will roar across the field, devouring everything, and leaving no survivors to Edom. I, the Lord, have spoken. Then my people living in the Negev will occupy the mountains of Edom. Those living in the foothills of Judah will possess the Philistine plains and take over the fields of Ephraim and Samaria. And the people of Benjamin will occupy the land of Gilead. The exiles of Israel will return to their land and occupy the Phoenician coast as far as north as Zarephath. The captives from Jerusalem exiled in the north will return to their homeland and resettle the villages of the Negev. Deliverers will go up to Mount Zion in Jerusalem to rule over the mountains of Edom, and the Lord himself will be king. So now you've read a book out of the Bible. Sometimes when preachers preach sermons, they like to use different techniques. And one of the ones that I'd use very sparingly, the senior pastor at Three Crosses in Castro Valley used to use it quite frequently, not as much anymore. And as that, you have some points. So we have 5 points to make, 5 lessons to learn from Obadiah. And so each one will start with the same letter of the alphabet. Now that sounds neat, and it is when the words come easy to what we're going to use. But let's look at verse 3 for our first lesson from Obadiah. You are proud because you live in a rock fortress and make your home high in the mountains. Who can ever reach us way up here, you ask boastfully. Don't fool yourselves. The first word is assumption. They assumed. They lived on a rock fortress. It was rough terrain. You couldn't use chariots against them. You couldn't use battering rams against them because it's rough and rocky and hilly. So they just assumed they were safe, that they wouldn't have to worry about being attacked by the enemy. We get some other lessons, and then I had prepared all these other scriptures. And when I went over my lesson this week, I realized that if I read all these scriptures, we'd be here well past noon. So what we're going to do is we're going to each, and if you're in your outline, you'll see, in the bulletin, you'll see that there's 3 passages of scripture for some of these and 2 for the others. And we're just going to read one of each passage as a scripture. And as a matter of fact, we'll start reading that, and if I start giving out, I may even cut that a little shorter. The first one's Numbers 13, verses 26 to 33. Numbers is the 4th book of the Bible. And all I have to do is now find chapter 13. And we begin in verse 26. To Moses, Aaron, and the people of Israel at Kadesh in the wilderness of Paran, they reported to the whole community what they had seen and showed them the fruit they had taken from the land. This was their report to Moses. We arrived in the land you sent us to see, and it is indeed a magnificent country, a land flowing with milk and honey. Here is some of its fruit as proof. But the people living there are powerful, and their cities and towns are fortified and very large. We also saw the descendants of Anak who are living there. The Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country. The Canaanites live along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea and along the Jordan Valley. But Caleb tried to encourage the people as they stood before Moses. Let's go at once to take the land, he said. We can certainly conquer it. But the other men who had explored the land with him answered, we can't go up against them. They're stronger than we are. So they spread discouraging reports about the land among the Israelites. The land we explored will swallow up, and any who go to live there. All the people we saw were huge. We even saw giants there, the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak. We felt like grasshoppers next to them, and that's what we looked like to them. 2 men assumed that because God had told them to take over this land, that it was conquerable. 10 men believed what their eyes saw. And what they saw were these large cities or towns with these nice fortified walls, and these people that looked like giants. And the reputation of some of them was quite cruel. If you came up to fight against them, they were going to annihilate you, wipe you out. They just weren't going to be nice about it. It would be a slaughter. So they assumed then that because of that, and because they didn't really have an army, they were kind of disorganized. They had been slaves for all these years, that they wouldn't stand a chance. So they said, even though it's flowing with milk and honey, we just can't take it. And so we look at Moses and we say what Moses told them to look out for. And you find out that when they came back, they gave that report. I think it's starting in verse, let me find out where I started. Moses back in verse 17 starts and says, now go out, go to the north country where there's grass and hills and water and streams, up in what we come to know it as Galilee. And the coastland was nice and green. And then you had the desert land from Jerusalem south, the Negev. He said, go check them out and find out what's going on. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or is it bad? Or the towns have walls or are they unprotected? Is the soil fertile for planting food and for grazing sheep and cattle? Are there a lot of trees? So go into the land boldly. And then bring back some samples. And growing up, and a lot of the Bibles, there would be different pictures. And one of the pictures I can remember from a kid, and this kid's Bible I had, was two men with a big pole on each shoulder and these big clumps of grapes that they were carrying back. And I said, they probably was raisins when they got back. But they assumed... There's 10, and they convinced the nation that they did not have what it took to conquer the land. In Joshua 7, we find the story of this small town. By the way, it was unprotected, so not all the cities had fortified walls. This little town called Ai, and they said, the spies came back to them and said, we can take it easy, no problem. So they assumed this was going to be a cakewalk. So they sent several thousand men up there. And this little town with no defenses, didn't look like they had a militia, they weren't ready, routed the Israelites and killed nearly 40 of them. Because the Israelites assumed they had superior power. In Luke 24, we have the story of two men walking away from Jerusalem to a town called Emmaus. And this other guy comes up and starts walking with them. He says, what's going on? They go, well, where have you been? Didn't you just hear about the death of this guy named Jesus in Jerusalem? We assumed he was the Messiah. And he said that after 3 days he was coming back. Well, this is the afternoon of the third day and he ain't back yet. So we're kind of lost because it looks like our assumption was wrong. So God is warning us in these 4 passages, excuse me, that assuming is wrong. And most of us probably are aware of the worldly euphemism for assume. So you don't want to assume, is what God is telling us through His Word. The second lesson we want to learn is from verse 10 in Obadiah. And I have a little piece of paper marking mine so I can keep coming back to it. Verse 10 says, and why? Because of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel. Now you will be destroyed completely and filled with shame forever. Verse 10 is assault or violence. They did wrong. to Israel. Now, how many of you have ever been physically assaulted? Okay, well, a few of us. I, fortunately, have never had anyone hit me. Well, I take it back. I've never had anyone hit me while I'm a Christian. But it says that these men assaulted the Israelites because they could, because they were enemies, because Israel had something they wanted. And then Jesus tells us in Matthew, the 5th chapter, we'll be turning there, he gives us what happens when assault occurs to us and how we are to look at assault. Because in the example here, and that's starting in verse 38, you have heard that the law of Moses says, if an eye is injured the eye of the person who did it. If a tooth is knocked out, knock out the tooth of the person who did it. But I say, don't resist an evil person. If you are slapped in the right cheek, turn the other too. If you are ordered to court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. So, I've never had someone come up and slap me in the face. I've had someone draw back their fist, but they never swung it. I've had a guy get in my face and spit in my face. And I've had numerous occasions of people getting in my face and cursing me out and threatening me. And I'm going to come across that counter and I'm going to all this kind of stuff. But God says, you aren't at liberty to fight back. You don't get that. You don't get to do that. If you're a Christ follower, when you're assaulted, you don't fight back. And that goes against our nature, but it does follow God's teaching. He also said if someone sues you and they win, and they want to take your shirt. Now, that's one reason why I'm using the New Living Translation today, because it uses some phrases that we're familiar with, and when he describes a shirt, because most versions won't use the word shirt because it's not really a shirt like we wear today. But believe it or not, back then they had 3 layers of clothing, and this was generally for the men. There was an undergarment, what we wear as our T-shirts, and then there was an outer cloak or tunic or garment, and it was what we call a shirt. And that's what they would usually wear. And then if it was cold or chilly or it was a formal occasion, you would then wear an outer garment, a third one. To us, it would be like a sports coat or an overcoat. And so Jesus says if they take the shirt, give them the coat too. How many times has someone demanded something of you, probably that they didn't deserve, and you gave them more than what they were asking for? And he then talks about going the mile, because in most versions it just says if someone demands that you walk with them a mile, walk with them 2. In the Roman Empire, a soldier carried a pack. That pack weighed anywhere from 35 to 50 pounds. So you can imagine if he was going just from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is 8 miles, what it would be like to carry a pack, 50-pound pack, for 8 miles. So the Roman government passed a law that said if a soldier sees a person who's capable of carrying that pack, he can require them to carry it for a mile. That was the law. Jesus says, well, if he makes you carry it 1, just take him 2. When we're assaulted, we return the assault with peace. We return the assault with praise. We return the assault with kindness. We need to work on returning the other cheek. We need to avoid hateful phrases and retorts and comebacks. Sometimes it means just taking a deep breath or swallowing hard. Our third lesson from Obadiah is in verse 11. For you deserted your relatives in Israel during their time of greatest need. You stood aloof, refusing to lift a finger to help when foreign invaders carried off their wealth and cast lots to divide up Jerusalem. You acted as though you were one of Israel's enemies. Aloof, of being aloof. I had a friend when I was young, and he's an older gentleman, and he passed away. And he had a dog, a big old Alaskan Malamute, 125-pound dog that was 17 years old. And while they were going through the mourning and doing all the preparation and the widow trying to adjust, they asked us if we would keep Skippy. That was the dog's name. And we said, sure, we'll keep Skippy. Now, we'd had Skippy for a couple weeks. And we left. I was preaching in Hollister by that time. And we lived in San Jose. So we would leave and be gone all day. Sometimes we'd leave on Saturday night. Sometimes we'd come back on Monday morning, whatever it was. But our house was always empty on Sunday. We had a neighbor to the left of us who was gone a lot of Sundays. We had a neighbor to the right of us who was gone a lot of Sundays. So that meant our house was sitting right there in the middle, easy pickings. And so we had two guys break in. And our dog, Skippy, just laid there and watched them take the stuff out. Because 2 weeks earlier, or a week earlier, when we were out walking with the dog, and he was on a kind of a long leash, one of those that kind of let you stretch when they're walking. So he was out in front of us, and this St. Bernard pup, which was big as Skippy, came gambling, and he was going to come between us. And that 17-year-old dog wheeled around and lunged and grabbed that St. Bernard by the neck and shook it. And, of course, the St. Bernard pup was shocked, and he took off running. The dog was protecting us, but he wasn't protecting the house because that wasn't his house. These were his people now, so he had to protect us. But his house was still in Milpitas. So he was aloof when it came to somebody taking stuff that wasn't theirs in somebody else's house. But in Revelation, verses 15 through 16, he tells us a story about a church. Now, if you are familiar with these two chapters in Revelation, John has been given a prophecy of the 7 churches of Asia. And this is the church in Laodicea. And it says in verse 15, I know all the things you do, that you are neither hot nor cold. I wish you were one or the other. But since you are like lukewarm water, I will spit you out of my mouth. You say, I'm rich. I have everything I want. I don't need a thing. And you don't realize that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked. One of the worst condemnations God puts on a church is a church that is lukewarm. What does being hot mean? What does being cold mean? Hot to me is a church that is on fire for telling people the good news of Jesus Christ, Him crucified, Him risen, Him in heaven, Him giving us salvation. I'm hot. I'm on fire to let people know that. I'm a cold church. I want you to know that the way you're living is wrong. I need to let you know. And there's ways to do that lovingly. You take a stand against immorality. You take a stand against criminal activity. You take a stand against lukewarmness. You take a stand against aloofness, assumption. You take a stand against these things. That's a cold church. Not cold doesn't mean you're dead or you're not doing anything. Cold means you're adjusting. You're approaching with trying to keep people to keep from doing wrong. The hot church is trying to make people alive and well and seeking and evangelizing. But if you are a church like Laodicea, you're ambivalent, apathetic, and you're aloof. God isn't going to tolerate it. He's not going to put up with it. If the church here is lukewarm, what's he going to do? That's what he's going to do. He's going to spit you out. He's going to forget you. He's not going to be inside this assembly on Sunday mornings. Because he's not going to put up with lukewarm, room temperature Christians. In Acts chapter 26, Paul was preaching this great sermon. And Agrippa, and it's neat because of the different versions of how Agrippa responds. It's amazing how many different takes you can get on just a few words by one man. In the King James, he said, which thou make, what's it say, Brian? Acts 26, 27 through 29. And Agrippa says, that's right. Why can't I forget? Thou almost persuadest me to be a Christian. In other words, with such few words, you think you're going to convert me? Another version says, well, you know what? If you had some more time, Paul, you'd probably convince me. How much convincing do you need to accept Jesus Christ? To become hot or to become cold? Our next lesson to learn from Obadiah is in verse 12. You shouldn't have done this. You shouldn't have gloated when they exiled your relatives to distant lands. You shouldn't have rejoiced because they were suffering such misfortune. You shouldn't have crowed over them as they suffered their disasters. Edom, you have no right to be arrogant. You have no right to think you're better than somebody else. You have no right to think you're right. You've got the power. You weren't conquered, and it was because of you. You aren't in the position you're in because of you, unless you're arrogant. And then you see yourself as being that person. In Luke 11:43, I'm not going to read there. I'm going to read Romans 11:18 to 22. I almost fooled myself. We want to look at a warning to the Roman church from Paul in Romans 11, starting in verse 18. But you must be careful not to brag about being grafted in to replace the branches that were broken off. Remember, you were just a branch, not the root. Well, you may say, those branches were broken off to make room for me. Yes, but remember, those branches, the Jews, were broken off because they didn't believe God, and you are here because you do believe. Don't think highly of yourself, but fear what could happen. For if God did not spare the branches he put there in the first place, he won't spare you either. Notice how God is both kind and severe. He is severe to those who disobeyed, but kind to you as you continue to trust in his kindness. But if you stop trusting, you will also be cut off. If you become puffed up, if you become proud, if you become self-satisfied, you're arrogant. Paul is warning the Gentiles here, the Gentile believers, because the Church of Rome was mainly Gentiles. And they were starting to feel better than the Jews because, look, he said, they threw out the Jews and they put us in their place. And Paul says, no. He says, this vineyard that we have and all these branches and vines that we have, the root is still Jesus Christ. It's not you. You're just a branch. And guess what? You're only a branch as long as you're producing. He said, we didn't expel the Jews for any reason other than that they weren't producing. That's why they lost. That's why they're cut out, is because they didn't produce. Not for any other reason. Not because you're better than they are. Because you aren't any better than they are. In Luke, in the passage in Luke 11, Luke 23, we find Pharisees and Sadducees and priests and scribes and lawyers. And they're all looking for recognition. Jesus gave us several examples of that. They wanted to be first at the table. Right? They wanted to be, if it was a dais and it was a presentation, they wanted to be up there getting an award. They wanted to be up on the platform being recognized for some great deed or some thought or whatever that they had. They wanted to be up there. They wanted to be recognized. They were arrogant. They thought they were better than everybody else. Jesus hanging on the cross. The arrogance, impudence, pride of these people walking by. Hey, you saved others. Why don't you come on down from the cross and save yourself? The church has no room for arrogance. It has no room for aloofness. It must tolerate assault and not fight back. This church cannot assume that it's right, that it is powerful. And the fifth lesson we learn from Obadiah is verse 15. The day is near when I, the Lord, will judge the godless nations. As you have done to Israel, so it will be done to you. All your evil deeds will fall back down on your heads. Now, I don't know exactly when. I was trying to find the dates, and it seems like the Hindu religion came along possibly after Obadiah was written. The reason I mention that is because it was mainly a Hindu belief of this thing called karma. And we're hearing it all over the place today, or I am. I'm even hearing Christians say karma. And I said, what are you talking about? Do you understand what karma is? And actually, karma is rooted in the fact that there's reincarnation. If you believe in reincarnation, you believe in karma. Because reincarnation says that the karma was what you do in this life is going to come back in the next life. So if you fall short in this life, you're going to be reincarnated into something else. It may not even be a person, to atone for what you did wrong in the first life. So when we start talking about karma, realize what you're talking about. Something that's very not Christian, very not in the Bible, except what he says here. And he says that all, as you have been into Israel, so it's going to be done to you. Jesus said it a little differently in Matthew 7:12. And most of us, if we don't know what's written in Matthew 7:12, we really do, because it says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So see, Jesus didn't say something new. He said something Obadiah had preached 700 years before. The word I'm looking for this time is appropriateness. What's going to happen to us is appropriate. And he continues in Matthew, and it begins actually in chapter 7 of Matthew. He begins with a series of contrasts between good and bad in the verses. And you look, he says, judge not that you be not judged, or stop judging others and you will not be judged. And I remind people of this every now and then, that when I hear someone say, oh, that person is terrible, or that person deserves this, or that person that, I remind them of Matthew 7. You're judging someone. God says, with what measure, whatever you use to judge other people, I'm going to judge you by. So if that person insulted you and you retaliated, how often do you insult God? Do you want his retaliation? He goes on in chapter 7 about taking the speck out of the eye and putting it back in. He gives us another challenging verse that gives some people problems about what he's actually talking about. And we don't have time to go into it this morning. Maybe some other time, or we can talk about it later. Don't give what is holy to unholy people, or do not give what is holy to the dogs. Don't cast your pearls before swine. They will trample the pearls, then turn and attack you. He goes on in chapter 7, though, of ask, and you'll be given. Look, you will find. Knock, and the door will be open. He gives us a nice analogy about being parents. He's telling us what's appropriate and not appropriate in life. And I want to conclude and wrap up the lesson today in Obadiah verses 17 and 18. But Jerusalem will become a refuge for those who escape. It will be a holy place, and the people of Israel will come back to reclaim their inheritance. At that time, Israel will be a raging fire, and Edom a field of dry stubble. The fire will roar across the field, devouring everything and leaving no survivors in Edom. I, the Lord, have spoken. I come up with two other words to describe what we to take away from this lesson. It's awful, or it's astonishing. In Obadiah, he dwells on the awful. In John 15, he dwells on the astonishing. John 15, verses 12 to 17. I command you to love each other in the same way that I love you. And here's how to measure it. The greatest love is shown when people lay down their lives for their friends. You are my friends if you obey me. I no longer call you servants because a master doesn't confide in his servants. Now you are my friends, since I have told you everything the Father told me. You didn't choose me, I chose you. I appointed you to go and produce fruit that will last, so that the Father will give you whatever you ask for using my name. I command you to love one another. In this passage, there was an awful thing. John starts off, he says a command. Now, there was a young man who just couldn't stand being told he had to do something. It just went against every fiber of his being. If you asked me to do anything, I would gladly do it. You tell me I have to do something, and you've already crossed the line. Because I was going to resist it. I was going to find a way to go around, or to resist, or to make it so uncomfortable that you won't tell me to do something again. Never worked with my parents. Then I went in the Marine Corps. And if I thought my parents were intolerant, I found out what intolerance was, to resist a command. To me, being given a command is an awful thing. The astonishing thing is the command Jesus gave us. One 4-letter word. Love. All boils down. It sounds so simple, sounds so trite, but sounds almost impossible. Love. There was an awful thing. He said that you may be required to lose your life. For most of us, that's an awful thing. The astonishing thing is, you're showing no greater love. You are being Christ-like. And if you're Christ-like, you know what comes afterwards. An awful thing is not being chosen by Jesus. Because he says, I chose you. I don't know what it feels like not to have Jesus. I don't know what it's like to not have hope. But the astonishing thing is, Jesus did choose us. And he goes beyond just choosing us. It's like a player for a team. He says, you're my friends. Jesus has chosen me to be his friend. Now, if that's not astonishing, nothing is. And he says, well, how do I get on Jesus' team? How do I get to make sure that Jesus chooses me? Is it some kind of magical predestination that I don't have any choice in? Or is it what he said just a chapter before and verses before? If you believe me, if you believe in me, I will come and live in you. He chooses us because we choose him. We can make assumptions. We can respond to assault. We can be aloof and arrogant. But brothers and sisters, you don't want to be those things. You don't want to be lukewarm. You don't want to be awful. You want to be astonished. You've got that decision to make. Issues will come up in a church's life, in our individual lives. We have to make some decisions. Some of them aren't pleasant. Some of them will hurt. But if God is the one making the decision, it will work out for his glory. Hurricanes, earthquakes, wars, rumors of wars, pestilence, violence, we got it all in spades, coming down like a rainstorm. All throughout history, there have been times in history when all of these conditions are present. And Jesus says it's during one of those periods of time, I'm coming back. You cannot go through Matthew or Revelation and find one thing that's not happening in those scriptures that's not happening today. You may not get to wake up again. You may not get to go to sleep tonight. You may not get to finish lunch today. We are in that time. Is he going to spit you out of his mouth? Or is he going to call you his friend? If the praise team would come forward and we'll sing a song. I don't even know I forgot the name of the song. Fortunately, it's only a few of them today, so we don't have to have a long way to hope. I thank you for being patient with me today. I thank the Lord for this podium that's helped hold me up, because I don't know, but a couple of times if it wasn't for this podium, Brian would have gotten to come up and finish. But I thank you for allowing me to be here. I am blessed to be here. And I pray that you are blessed for being here. So would we stand? And if you have any need this morning that you need to publicly confess or share with the people, the elders will be forward.